All right, we're gonna go ahead and get started. So happy equinox, everybody.
Yeah.
Welcome to the first Maple Hour. Thanks for joining us. I'm Jeremy Solin. I'm the Maple Syrup Project Coordinator with UW-Madison Division of Extension, and the host for Maple Hour, which I'm excited to get started with. And I'm joined by Brad Hutnik, who is a forest ecologist and forester with Wisconsin DNR Division of Forestry. And our topic tonight is everything maple trees, maple tree identification, distribution in the state. And so we'll get to that in a bit, but welcome, Brad. Thank you for being here. Good to see you.
Hey, thanks for having me. Yeah, we can go any place you want with maple, so
Yeah,
it'll be fun.
Yeah, I know it'll be good.
Yeah.
And then also just want to mention that Lindsay Matthews is helping us out tonight as well. Lindsay's a student working with us at UW-Madison Extension. So Lindsay, thanks for your help tonight. And before we jump into the discussion about all things maple trees, just give you a little bit of layout of the logistics. So we have a few questions for Brad that we'll talk about for 20-30 minutes, something like that, and then we'll open it up for questions, and we'll at least initially focus on questions directly related to the topic tonight of tree identification and distribution. But then if there's other places we want to go with the discussion, we can do that too. So, and we'll wrap up within an hour, and at the end I'll share some resources and upcoming events, things like that.
Yep.
So
yeah, if we go into silviculture, wherever we go, it's all good.
Right. All good stuff. So
all good.
To start with, Brad, why don't you give us a little bit of background of how you got into this world of trees and forestry, and what your experience is there.
Yeah. So again, my name is Brad Hutnik, and like Jeremy said, I work as a forest ecologist and as a silviculturist with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. And it's funny, I kind of came around to forestry kind of like, I don't know, like kind of in a roundabout way. So I didn't like go, hey, I'm doing this, kind of stuff. And in fact, I often joke that when we were in school, that we had to read a Sand County Almanac. And I was like, oh my God, like you'd open it up and skunk be dragging its belly in the snow. You're like, oh, come on, like I got to read something else. So it took me forever. But I kind of, at a certain point in my life, it was kind of like, what do you want to do? And what do you want to, it kind of and going to the DNR and kind of working in natural resources kind of made sense. And so I wound up going to the University of Wisconsin, Stevens Point. And actually Jeremy and I were there at the same time. So that was kind of cool stuff. That was a long time. It doesn't feel that long ago, Jeremy.
It doesn't, but it turns out it was quite a while ago.
Yeah, I saw some pictures recently of a Halloween party that my wife and I went to. There was a woman named Ann Snodgrass that we went to school with. She owned the house, and I had to put gray in my hair to look old because I was going as Professor Schabel, and I don't have to fake that anymore. Yeah. So that was good. But basically, so I got my degree at Stevens Point. And my wife, and this is kind of, I always tell the story that my wife and I, we were both going to school. She was going to school for library science. And we kind of decided whoever gets a job first, that's where we're going. And so coming out of Stevens Point, I kind of had my compass pointed north, like, oh, we're going to go to Ashland, and we're going to be like, someplace great. She got a job in Mazomanie, Wisconsin, which is like outside of Madison. And I'm like, oh, great. So that first year, like she got the job, and so we went south. And I remember I was working a temp job. I graduated and I was working a temp job at Sears assembling Christmas trees. And I'm thinking, this is how I put my education to work, kind of basically making sure like, right there. Yeah, good fake trees look real. But it got better. Then I got a job. I eventually worked with and spent about 5 years working for Clark Forestry in Baraboo and Poinette, Wisconsin. And that was a really good education. A lot of things ecological. Fred Clark was the principal forester there, and it's a really good education. And then after that, I went to the DNR. I worked in the Lower Wisconsin State Riverway as the forester there, and that's basically state lands between Sauk City and Wyalusing. And then, so worked on that for about 10 years. And then I came over to the silviculture side about 10 years ago. And so I've been here ever since. And but I have to say, every day we learn something new. And so that's, I think, one of the best things about anything we do right now is that we're learning new stuff all the time.
Yeah, that's great. I didn't realize you worked with Fred. I didn't know that part of your experience, but that's
yeah, way back in the day. In fact, Fred sent me a picture, I think last year or the year before, and it was of actually maybe it's a couple of years before that now, but it was of he and I and one of our coworkers, Joel Green, on a fire. And so it was really kind of like old home days. And I still have some old Clark Forestry shirts that I can't wear for work, but I wear them at other, that kind of stuff. So
yeah, nice. Fred's a maple syrup producer as well.
Yep.
Got into it a little while ago. So
yep.
Yeah. So tell us about maple trees in Wisconsin. How many are there, and where are they, and what is their abundance?
Yeah. So what's kind of cool is, so oftentimes we think about some of these major tree species that define or help define some of the systems that we have here, right? So if you're in central Wisconsin, you might be like, say, in a jack pine. So you have jack pine, and then it defines a lot of things. And so pine trees can be doing that. And maples are really well distributed throughout the state. In fact, there's not a county in the state that doesn't have a maple that's native to it. So maples are well distributed throughout the state. And I was mentioning to Jeremy, but I think we're going to develop something after our happy hour here. It's going to be called the Wisconsin Maple Slam. So it's basically, you have to visit every maple species that we have, or you have to document that you've seen every maple species in the state, or grab a leaf from it, something like that. So it'll be pretty cool. But technically we have, and I'll say for tonight, technically we have 9 species that we can work with, and different types of maple. So, and some of them are the easy ones that you think of, and then others are kind of like very, very restricted. So as a great example, like sugar maple and red maple are slightly different in terms of their silvix. So sugar maple is that species of northern Wisconsin and rich mesic sites that we think about. We have it here in the driftless area. We have it in the southeastern part of the state commonly, and then northern Wisconsin, it's a really common species. Later successional, very shade tolerant, and kind of that primary species that we think about when we think about like maple syrup and maple syrup production. But there's a lot of work, and I think you guys might be familiar with it too, saying, well, there are other species you can work with, and red maple is one that people have worked with, and they've produced some fine tasting syrups with that as well. They're both kind of increasing, or they have been increasing as far as the volume and number of trees in the state. And in red maple in particular, has been a transitional species on a lot of sites here in southern Wisconsin with like oak stands. So if you leave the disturbance out of those sites long enough, you'll get something a little more shade tolerant that can come in. And so oftentimes that'll be a sugar maple, but oftentimes a red maple, depending upon the context too. Mm-hmm. But I said we were 9, so that's only 2.
We got to 2.
So yep. So we do have. So we also have one that oftentimes people don't think about being a maple, which is the box elder. Yep. And I often wondered about that name. Why is it box elder? And actually, in doing a little research for this discussion, it sounds like early settlers were familiar with white-wooded species, and so there's a boxwood in Europe and Britain and other places that's a white-wooded species. And so this being white-wooded, it was a box tree to them, and then the foliage to them looked a little bit like elder, so more like elderberry, elder, things like that they would have in their back there. And so they just combined those two. So elder, or a box elder, kind of came to be. Now, it's also known by a lot of other things, and I got a kick out of it. It's also known as Manitoba maple. Yeah. And you can actually, if you get into parts of Canada that up in the prairie areas, they'll saw it, and you can buy boards of Manitoba maple and things like that. So we don't think about that here, but I guess, what's that song? If you can't be with the one you love, you got to love the one you're with. So you saw box elder trees and work like that.
I think that's also true of making maple syrup out of box elder, which people do, and it's an interesting syrup and can be really good. Yep. Although I have a friend who will argue it's it's not just because he, has to make syrup out of it. It's because he wants to, right? It's
Well,
what he
I've
chooses.
done that where we've tapped maple trees in the neighborhood, and oftentimes you can't get picky, so you just decide, hey, you're a maple, so
Yeah.
so it's added to our sap, and we haven't been able to tell any difference because of it.
Yeah.
So that's been pretty good. So you get up to 3. Actually, so we have the other one then that it's one of the big 4, the most common ones we have then is silver maple too. And so if red maple is kind of that, it's an interesting species compared to sugar maple, and that sugar maple is a fall seeded species. It likes a lot of shade. It kind of and it develops, it can be real dense understories where it occurs as well. Red maple is a spring seeding species, so it's probably adapted to a little different disturbance regime. So it's not, so it's maybe a little more, maybe associated with water a little more, as far as that usually the spring kind of stuff is a little bit different as far as the disturbance regimes that we think of. And that would definitely be true of silver maple. So it's also a spring seeding species found in bottomlands and swamp hardwood stands that we have here in Wisconsin. It's probably between red maple and that one, they're our fastest, I'm sorry, between silver maple and box elder, those are probably our 2 fastest growing of the maples.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that, you'll often see the silver maple planted in urban situations, just because it's real fast growing. And then you'll also see inadvertently growing in a lot of urban situations, the box elder. Maybe people aren't planting it, but it's persisting or thriving around the edges of like our urban situations. So that one is really cool. I have seen some research, Jeremy, that's been looking, especially in Illinois, where they were looking at sap or sugar content in silver maples.
Yeah.
And because it could grow it very fast, you could get it large, and you could take advantage of growing it in a lot of different situations that sugar maple may not be adaptable to.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, exactly. I have a great picture burned into my mind of a friend of mine collecting sap in hip boots. He has silver maples, in a floodplain, and
yeah,
it's the only way to get to his trees is to wade through the water to get to them. But makes great syrup out of it, and has pretty decent sugar content. So yeah,
that would be a cool way to take a canoe around to your trees, in the spring to get the sap. That would be really fun.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So then we kind of have a series of other ones too that are a little less common and perhaps on the smaller side too. So we also have mountain maple, which is fairly common. It's that understory shrub species that can get fairly dense at times in northern Wisconsin, and it's really well distributed in northern Wisconsin. But a cousin to it is also striped maple. And so striped maple is a little more common, say in like the northeastern United States, kind of New York, parts of Pennsylvania, getting up into even Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, areas like that. Here in Wisconsin, we have one population on Door County. And if you go onto the UW Green Bay website, they kind of talk about the discovery of it, which it's a more recent discovery too, like only in the 90s that we found striped maple. Which, and it's fascinating to me, of all the time people spend in Door County, and then that's the place you find something like a small tree growing that people haven't noticed before. So that I think that got us through some of them as well. We do occasionally see crosses because we have the sugar maple is kind of isolated because the sugar maple is a little more isolated in the fall, except for one other species I'll mention. So we do see crosses sometimes with black maple. Mm-hmm. And black maple is interesting because it's kind of it's a southern cousin of kind of like the sugar maple. So it may have been isolated and passed by maybe past climatic changes, or say things like maybe even something like the ice age or something like that. But it's found a little bit further west in Iowa than we actually see sugar maple growing. And so theoretically, it might be adapted to, drier conditions or more droughty conditions than sugar maple may be adapted to. Yeah. So we have those two, so they can interbreed or, kind of go back and forth. And then the same thing in the spring, we can see red and silver maple also doing that. Okay. It's really hard with the black maple. when you look at the trees, you might not necessarily say, oh, that's a black maple or that's a sugar maple, but it's more like leaf characteristics. So oftentimes if I'm going past a maple tree and there's a possibility it might be a black, if you feel like a furry underside to that leaf, you're going, oh, maybe I should start to look a little deeper. This might be a black maple.
Yeah.
And we were just talking about, there's a place called the Forest Exploration Center in Wauwatosa. And I was doing that there, and I do believe that about a large percentage of the maple they have are actually black maple.
Oh, really? Oh,
So yeah. So not too much difference as far as like maple or like the sap. It seems like it's pretty similar between those.
Yeah.
But there may be some genetic differences that are good for climate change in the future. We're going to find out more about that as time goes on.
Yeah.
So it's really hard. Once you start to see that interbreeding, it's usually called either a sugar or a black. But the other one we see is there's a cross that's fairly distinct, and that's the red and the silver. And so there you can get a lot of the silver characteristics, but it might be a little more straight, right? So you may have a little better form on it than what you would expect on a silver maple, a little less lower branching and things of that nature. And so that one has actually entered the horticulture trade. So we're seeing that one used as street trees oftentimes because it's fairly fast growing, kind of one of its parents is doing that, but it's still got form and avoid some of the problems that silver maple has as a street tree.
Yeah. Interesting.
And then, so if you have that, then we still have two, and this is more of the rogues gallery end of the maples in the state. So these are the ones that, just like us, weren't here originally. And so that's the Amur maple, which is more of a shrub or kind of a very small tree. You see that commonly planted. And then probably the most common planted urban tree that we have, which is Norway maple. So you do have quite a few, and they run. What's really unique about the maples that we have too is that they really do run a gamut of ecological landscapes, but even those landforms or positions within the landscape or these natural communities, they're really well distributed across those as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. I was trying to come up in my own head with the 9, and I forgot the Amur maple. So that was the one I was missing.
And so if you want to do the slam, if you want to do the Wisconsin maple slam, you're going to probably have to take that drive to Door County.
Yeah. To Door
and you're
County.
probably going to have to take the drive that doesn't just take you to Sturgeon Bay. You're going to have to go all the way up to the tip.
Yeah.
And then, so you better hope you can find the rest of them along the way.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. If you can find that one and then track down a black maple, those will be the challenges, right? So
yeah, you barely be. Yeah, the black is going to be, there are black. It's kind of interesting because black kind of goes up to about the middle part of the state and then becomes real spotty to the north, which kind of makes sense that it's a southern species and we're more at the northern end of the range for it versus sugar maple. We're more at the southern end of a northern range species. So yeah, it's kind of cool. But that being said, we're not super, like if you look at it too, sugar maple does extend way to the south of us as well. So you can still find it in Missouri and Tennessee and other places. So
yeah,
so we're not completely at the south end.
Yeah, of those, we talked about some of these, obviously sugar maple, red maple, box elder, silver as trees that we can make syrup out of. But Norway is one of those as well that people tap and you can make syrup out of. So especially in those urban settings. And I've even seen Norway kind of escape the urban setting a little bit on the edges and be fairly kind of prevalent in some kind of, pseudo urban areas where it can get to decent size and be pretty prevalent. But.
Yeah, you do see that. I've seen some in the Milwaukee area, some small stands that are naturally reproducing Norway maple. I know in the Chicago region they have quite a few of those, and they're a little problematic because oftentimes there isn't they don't look at them as maple production, but they look at them as really being shady. And then there isn't a lot that's really designed to grow in the shade of those things. So it can get to be pretty barren in the understory.
Yeah.
But yeah.
So maybe let's talk a little bit about identification. This is a little bit hard, not in the field, but that's one of the, common questions among maple syrup producers. Is how do you identify a maple tree, especially when there aren't leaves on it? But so I'm wondering, just based on your experience, what are some of the characteristics that you look for?
Yeah, so if I'm thinking about and looking at maples and trying to, and if you have access to, so oftentimes if you're looking at the really big trees, sometimes you want to look at certain characteristics that you have access to at different times of the year. So if you can see the branches, and oftentimes if you're in a normal situation, you can find branches on the ground underneath that tree, or you can basically just look at them, like usually they're not that far away. But what you can see oftentimes are that the branches will have this opposite branching, so you'll have a main leader, and then you'll have like a branch on each side. And that's a good indication. If you're here in Wisconsin and you're seeing trees with opposite branches coming off on opposite sides, it's either going to be a maple or it's going to be a ash, and less it's ash now because we're just having problems with that. So I use that in the winter. That would be a real big one. Red maple, when it's young, has a very smooth bark, and it can actually be like almost deceptively smooth, like for a longer period of time in its life compared to, say, a sugar maple. Mm-hmm. Deceptively, though, too, red maple, when it gets real old, can be very like a craggy bark, like almost a shaggy. And I think I don't know if I was mentioning it to you, Jeremy, but I think it's always good to tell those stories where you're like, and sometimes you're wrong, right? Like so those things always happen. And I remember one time I was working on a property, and I was working in an inventory team with another person, and I called out I said, "Oh, that's a shagbark hickory, like 22 inches or something like that." And then just to kind of twist the knife, the person I'm working with says, "Why does it have maple leaves?" And so you look up, and sure enough, oh crap, so it was a red maple, but it had just super furrowed, like the bark was almost like strips of it kind of coming off at the bottom. So oftentimes I look at things like that. If you have access to the leaves, it's even better, right? Because you can see, like with the sugar maple, we talk about like the bays. So if you had like the branches kind of, or the leaf itself, like this is the main part, and then the part that comes off, you talk about the little bays and sinuses on it. And it's on a sugar maple that those kind of corners are rounded. And so the black and silver, they'll be really rounded in that area. But on a silver and on a red maple, they'll be they'll be like an acute angle to it. So it'll be kind of a sharp in and out kind of stuff like that. Yeah. And really, if you're thinking, and then if you get to look at the red versus the silver, it'll be just the silver is, I always think of it as being a little more like a skeletonized version of a red, right? Like it's not quite as meaty of a leaf. It's a little more, just everything slightly thinner. So it's just adapted to a different condition.
Yeah, this is one of the things I like about tree identification, when you start asking people how they identify and like the terms that they use. Because one of the things that I often tell people about sugar maple identification, when I look at a sugar maple, yeah, it seems like really like tight and hard to me. Like you look at the bark, you're like, man, that's a tough looking tree. But some people are like, what are you talking about? It just looks like a tree, But it's you kind of develop those, like the sense of the trees after you see them, but kind of like the skeleton sense of the leaf of a silver maple versus the other ones.
Yeah. And even like you almost get a sense of the architecture when you've seen enough of them too. Mm-hmm. Right? Like you can be driving by at 55 miles per hour and know it's a red versus a sugar, just because you're familiar with that, the way the branches kind of come off on it, or the way the branches actually hang off of that tree and things like that. So I think sometimes that comes with experience too, just being able to look at those and do things. Yeah. And I am, it's kind of funny. I do, the one thing that I recommend to a lot of people now, especially as you're trying to get a hold of these things, is there are a lot of apps that kind of really help with telling us like what a plant is. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes maybe not the twig, like in the winter, it might be a little harder. I haven't tried any of the apps for that yet, to say a picture of the twig and see if it tells you what it is. But for the leaves or for some of the other characteristics, there are some really interesting through iNaturalist, or even the other one I saw, which is just on your like your iPhone. So if you take the picture and do the little information thing, it'll tell you what that is. Yeah. So that's another way that, like, if you don't have anything else, any other clue, that might be just a good place to start too.
Yeah. Yeah, those apps are pretty amazing. I know I've been skeptical of them, but been with people who use them and are like, yeah, they're pretty accurate.
I'm
Um,
I'm I'm always a skeptic until I'm convinced.
that's
And
right.
I'm like, oh
Yeah,
damn, that's pretty cool.
yeah, right.
So I
I
act
don't
like I've been accepting of it the whole time afterwards.
yeah,
But
right.
yeah,
Um, One thing to maybe talk about, as long as we're talking about identification a little bit, is one of the things we notice in maples is the blackened bark on some trees. I especially notice in sugar maples, but I've seen it on red maples as well. Um, and sometimes people think those are what we mean by black maple, but that's just
right.
a growth on the bark actually. So what is that? What's
Yeah.
happening with those trees?
So there's a number of different conditions that can do that on maples. Sometimes you can get wounding that will actually produce like sap flows and will do things like that. But there are also some kind of aphids and some other insects that will actually produce uh, like a honeydew that will become like a sooty mold that kind of is on those trees. For the most part, we don't really see a lot of, I mean, so something's actually producing that and it's producing this condition that's on the stems. I've often seen that. I don't see it as much on red maple, but I do see it a lot on sugar maple.
Mhm.
And so I think that's kind of the almost like a characteristic for identification. Just like if you're familiar with like a black knot on cherry, it forms
Yeah,
that kind of the like that growth on the things. If you see that, you're okay. That's a cherry because I can't tell anything else, but at least I know it's got that growth I can identify.
yeah,
And so
yeah,
we've used that as well, kind of that as a marking or as a characteristic to just driving past to note whether there was a lot of sugar maple in that stand was that sooty mold. So
yeah,
it doesn't seem to be a problem as far as health, but it is just a cosmetic thing that we kind of see quite often on those trees.
yeah. Yeah, one of the interesting things about um, sap flow out of those trees is that, at least in my experience and others I've talked to, that's true too. It's those trees generally are really good producers of sap.
Yeah,
And it's probably a bit of kind of two sides of something, but I think the dark coloration absorbs more sunlight early in the spring and therefore warms the tree up, and you get more kind of pressure differential in that tree because of that
oh yeah,
increased
yeah,
heat. But it also might be because the trees that have sugar or higher sugar content and are leaking that sap out are more likely to host that sooty mold,
yeah.
be a food source for that. So it's kind of
And I could see it being almost like a little bit of a stress too, that kind of causes that tree to kind of do something. Like I know some apple producers will take and I don't know if this is just theory on my part, but like they'll take a razor and run it around the tree, and
yeah,
just that cutting of the phloem will be enough to actually spur it to do a little more fruiting than it might be do otherwise.
yeah,
So any kind of minor stress might be enough to say, hey, I might have to really pick up my game.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. All
Yeah.
right,
So,
so
and what you're saying, Jeremy, though, is I need to find a friendly paint that I can paint on my trees
that's
to
right. Yeah,
really, because if I can turn them to black, then maybe I can get a little more sap production.
yeah, maybe
Yeah.
that's an interesting strategy. I'll have to try
That's
that
it's a
out.
silviculture trial, and we're willing to do it.
That's right.
Yeah.
So given time, maybe one last question here, just kind of briefly get into this at least. What can we expect for the future of maple in Wisconsin, given kind of where we are in the succession of our forests and the aging of our forests? You talked about that a little bit with red maple coming up in oak forests, but also
Yeah.
what we know about climate change and some of the climate shifts that'll happen.
Yeah. So I think what we've seen in a lot of ways, so we've seen the maturing of the maple resource in Wisconsin. So we don't yet have like really, so what we do lack are really old maple stands, right? So historically we would have had maple stands, kind of what you would see like on the Menominee Nation's lands, right? So they would have been these larger trees with a lot of other size classes mixed in, a lot of diversity of spacing of the trees in these areas, and then kind of scattered regeneration kind of thing. So the old growth characteristics that maybe we don't have that, but our stands are maturing, and we're basically being able. It's going to be over time. The hope is that we'll be able to more easily produce some of those conditions. So as our resources mature, it's like after the cutover, we kind of had this big flush of maple that came through. So we're working with that maple still. And so the hope is that we'll be able to diversify that, or a little more a variety in some things, and that'll be really useful as far as things go. in the past, we've seen expansion of maple in Wisconsin. And particularly, we can think about red maple and sugar maple. So there are people still in southern Wisconsin. Think of people who live in the coulees of Vernon County, Crawford County, Grant County, some places like that, where they remember their valleys not having sugar maple. And now the valleys have a ton of sugar maple in them. And this probably goes back to the changes in natural disturbance regimes that we have. So where fires and grazing and even farmer lit fires may have really limited things that were a little more fire sensitive, like sugar maple or red maple. Now we don't have that, right? So that's gone. The seed source is available on the landscape. And because we don't have those fires, we're not seeing these stands remaining open. We're seeing oak stands not reproducing, but having this empty niche, quote unquote, right? So there's so the maple or the oak aren't reproducing in their own shade, but the maples can thrive in the shade of the oaks. And so a lot of oak stands are transitioning into more shade tolerant species, and maple are one of those species or one of those groups that can take advantage of that. And so we are seeing an expansion of that. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? That's just a different successional pathway. It's still valid. It just depends on, do you want it to be more closely related to what historically happened on these sites, or do you want to work with this new kind of arrival on the block? So we've seen some expansion in that. We're seeing a slight aging in what we have right now. For the future with climate change, because they're very common, what we might see is, and you can think about it intuitively, that with climate change, species don't necessarily all go downhill just because of climate. They'll be affected by disturbance, by where they occur on the landscape, by the local conditions where they occur. And so a great example is, if you think about stuff like hemlock occurring across the state. Or maybe in the face of glaciers kind of coming down and making them grow every place. But as that glacier recedes, then that environment changes. And so it only means it can grow in certain places after that. And so now we see these conifer relics in parts of southern and central Wisconsin where you still see it, even though the next neighbor that we have for it is maybe 50, 60 miles away. And so theoretically, right now, the maples are doing fine. They're not necessarily projected to do poorly. Surprisingly, in some of the projections I've seen, at least in southern Wisconsin, sugar maple should do okay. The red maple might have a little more problem. So we can watch this, and this is probably going to keep changing as our science on climates get better. It'll change a little bit. But the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science has done some handouts where you can look at what are the major tree species in those areas and how are they projected to fare. You can also see them in, and we have some examples, you can get this online. So we have these climate change field guides for northern and southern Wisconsin. And these you can actually, they're available on the Wiki Forestry Working Group website, but you can also get them from the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. So you can get hard copies, but you don't need it. There are PDF versions online that you can reference as well. And so they'll tell you a little bit in here too about if you know where you are, they can tell you what are the projections for the different tree species in the areas you're looking at. And the very best in all of these are based on the Climate Change Tree Atlas, which is a website. So if you just Google Climate Change Tree Atlas, it'll give you, you can dial it in and it can tell you specifically about what are the characteristics that are either going to be good, are going to work in its favor, or work against a particular species, like say sugar maple, in the face of climate change. But right now I would say that it's not, I wouldn't say that it's a bleak picture, but what we might see is, and this is kind of one of the things that we might think about, is that we might be pretty good for say the next 100 years, but after that point, if things continued on, then you might see a problem. And so that's where having a diversity of species in these sites. So just because you have maple doesn't mean you necessarily want to get rid of oak, right? So that way you kind of have, you have options in case something occurred. And so oftentimes in some of our sites, especially here in the South, sugar maple's thriving. The lack of disturbance is producing a lot of it. And the oak are disappearing, but at some point in the future, the oak may be more appropriate because of climate change, and we may not have it. So we may be walking into a dead end, at least on some sites in southern Wisconsin. Northern Wisconsin, I wouldn't think it's not going to be as bad, but it's still going to be a concern, and it's probably not going to be necessarily we're going to extinguish maple in these sites, but we're going to probably have more problems associated with maple management.
Yeah, cool. Thank you for that.
Yep.
So maybe we should open up, see if there are any questions from anyone. So any questions related to tree identification, distribution, possible maples on your land, any of those kind of things, or if you want to get into management, we can do some of that too. And you can either unmute yourself and share your question, or if you want to drop it in the chat, you can do that as well. So yeah, we'll open it up.
While we're waiting for questions, Jeremy, I was going to make a brandy old fashioned. My favorite recipe has maple syrup in it, but I didn't. So I just went with the. I'm not giving up on summer. I'm having a gin and tonic.
Holding on to summer.
I am not going to let it go yet.
That's right.
Yep.
We covered everything, huh?
No.
Yeah. One of maybe as people are thinking about questions, let's throw another resource out there. I know Glyphwick is also working on vulnerability assessments for major species, and maple being one of those. So that's, I think their initial assessment is out, and then they're working on an update that's coming out pretty soon, or maybe that's been released, but there'll be another resource as well.
Yep.
Jeff, I'll put you on the spot as long as you hear anything you want to share.
Oh, you're going to talk a little bit about the International Maple Conference in La Crosse coming up?
Yeah, I will mention that.
Yeah, excited about that. So,
yeah,
something I have.
Yeah, so that is an opportunity. I'll actually share my screen real quick just so folks can see the website here. So that conference is coming up the end of October, so a little over a month away. October 26th through the 29th is the main conference, with kind of opening session on Thursday, tours and other events on Friday, exhibits, things like that on Friday, and then Saturday is the technical sessions. And then following the conference, although it's still part of it, there is the Maple grading school. So if you go into the registration materials, you'll find information about the grading school as well. So that's called the IMSI grading school. So it's an opportunity to learn more about maple syrup quality. That happens on Sunday and Monday. So lots going on there, including Lindsay and Jeff and I and a bunch of other folks are working on putting together tribal producers and sugar making network as part of that. So we'll meet on Friday, and attend the sessions on Saturday as well. So lots of good things going on there for sure. Thanks for bringing that up, Jeff. Any other questions? Check the chat real quick. I don't think I'm seeing anything in there.
No,
good.
Not yet.
Yeah, maybe, I don't know, Brad, anything wrap up? We've covered some good ground.
Yeah,
super informative.
You know, it is interesting. I think one of the things that would be really interesting to explore in the future would be some of the opportunities so we think of like these non-traditional or non-timber forest products, and maple syrup fits into that real nicely. But I think there are some other opportunities, especially when we start to think about our maple stands and depending upon the area that you're located. And so I've been real curious, like a lot of we don't do a lot of production of it, but I think we're going to talk more about those in the future. And so two things that would come into play with that would be things like ramps or wild leeks. And I know that there are certain parts of the state where we can really grow some dense understories of those, which are, I think, really I think that's going to be really interesting because I've seen more and more conversation about stuff like that. And so I anticipate that over time, that'll be just something to keep in mind for people, that there could be other opportunities in our maple forest that we may want to think about, not only sugar maple, but some other things that go with that.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And the other one would be that sugar maples are long-lived species, and I'll pick on sugar maple right now, but they are long-lived, and so there might be opportunities as well for managers that are thinking about trying to preserve, and there may be a way to kind of think about this with sugar bushes, where if you're trying to preserve and have large trees that you want to persist for a long time, that there could be a niche or a way to combine that with some of the climate mitigation markets that we have too. So you might be able to do SAP, and you may be able to do something like the carbon markets, and think about how that might integrate with the silviculture that you're doing on those sites. Mm-hmm. So I think there's going to be room for exploration of these things in the future.
Yeah. I think that one in particular is going to be really interesting as those markets develop and we figure out how much carbon can we actually store in those forests for, extended period of time.
Yeah. Nope, I agree.
Nope, we have a question here about the best types of trees besides maples that you should try to keep in your stand. And are there undesirable species maybe to deal with?
So I would say, for the most part, if it's a forest tree species, I'd say I don't tend to think of and my coworker Greg Edge and I, we debate this a little bit, because I'll say, well, I'm not sure if there's any really undesirable species. I mean, you may not want a lot of it, but you don't want to just lose it all, right? So even things like ironwood, right? So ironwood isn't necessarily a canopy species, but there are. I mean, it's really interesting. I've seen pictures of late winter grouse feeding in the catkins and these things are on the seeds for it. Where I'm like, well, now you're really thankful you had that tree, right? Because it's helping support something that's in that stand. So I think everything in moderation, right? So if you if I'm working in southern Wisconsin, I'd be thankful for, even though I might have long-term problems with some of the hickory diseases or the hickory dieback events that occur. Bitternut hickory is a fine species to have. The oaks, if you can get them to persist, they may not reproduce, but if you can get them to persist in those stands, would be really good. The ashes, while we have them, are fantastic. So I don't think necessarily there are bad species, but I would say just you might want to look at what are the implications of it over time. So like black locust, I might want to think about, as long as I'm not doing really severe openings in the stand, it's okay. But if I'm trying to protect some open area and I have locust next to it, then that might be more of a problem. So
yeah, I've seen some recent recommendations. I think this was actually in the Maple Syrup Producers Manual. The most recent edition is kind of the target of non-maple species is somewhere around at least 15% you should think of. And that's I would say that's a ballpark depending on what your situation is. But I think, as you mentioned, having that diversity is really important, given keeping options open for the future, but also just habitat for other species and just all the things we don't know yet about how forests interact and the health of trees and all the other plants and species in the forest. So
yeah, I think it's really wise. It seems like we always forget the lesson about having one thing, putting all of your eggs in one basket tends to be a problem. And I was just reading it was a thing about some villages that had had all their ash taken out. And so what were they doing? They were planting all of something else in there. It's like, I don't know. That's kind of problematic. On that note, it's interesting. We do have a problem that's occurred in Wisconsin historically, and it's called mapleization. And what mapleization was is that oftentimes in northern Wisconsin, we had stands that maybe had a diversity of tree species, think about yellow birch and white pine and hemlock and some of these other species that probably occurred. They may not have dominated the site, but they were always present in these sites. But our management, single tree selection, or what we've interpreted as single tree selection, has created very small openings and left a lot of shade. And so basically what's happened is over time, we've lost those other species and we've slowly just accumulated and made these almost single species or 1 or 2 species sites. And so oftentimes there, we're going backwards and if we can, creating openings in those stands and underplanting a host of other species to kind of bring back some of the diversity that we would have expected on those in these stands.
Yeah.
So if you have the diversity protected, if you don't have it there, yeah, you might have to pay the piper and start planting other things into the stand.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. So I think we can wrap up. I'll share just a couple of other real quick resources before we close. So I talked about the conference. For those of you who haven't seen it, our extension maple syrup program just recently published our website, so you can see that here, but resources there for kind of all different kinds of situations. If you're just getting started as a producer, if you're a resource manager, general public kind of interest, and relevant to the discussion tonight, there is a short tree identification video as part of this that Darren Kimbler did up in Iron County Extension, and then some management resources and all kinds of things related to maple syrup products and things like that. And that's something we'll continue to build as we develop more resources as well. And then to Dana's note, question, the plan with Maple Hour is to hold these every month moving forward. So our next one will be October 13th is the plan. That one's a little bit up in the air yet, but the plan is for that to focus on energy efficiency in the sugar bush and Sugar Shack, and with our guest being from Natural Resource Conservation Service to talk about some of the financial support that they provide for that. So that's coming up, and then we'll kind of continue on from there, cover the host of topics kind of related to maple. And at any point, if you're have other ideas of things you want us to cover, I'm always open to that. So just let me know. So, but this was it was a great start, Brad, for our first session. That was awesome. I appreciate you sharing all your experience and knowledge with us. And
but in the future, maybe we'll do like maple trivia or something, seeing as we're both pointers, so we got to go back and do the whole trivia thing.
That's right, for sure. And we have to figure out how to get that maple slam off the ground, get that going, right? So see
maple slam it
first.
Maybe I'll be the very first person to claim a maple slam in Wisconsin, so I'll try and get press for it.
Yeah, we'll see what we can do.
Yeah.
Good deal. All right. Well, thank you very much, Brad. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Good to see you.
Yep. Thanks, everyone.
Yep.
Have a good
Thanks,
night.
Jeremy.
Hopefully we'll see you in October. All right. Take care.
Bye.